Then hello again and welcome to those who join us first now. My name is Nicolas Rosenthal. I'm the Executive Director of the Protestant Foundation Hora de Obrar, Time to Act, present in Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. We are members globally of ACT Alliance. And I have the pleasure this evening to moderate this block. And we will begin first with Lawrence Heath-Moore, who is the Mission and Discipleship, Church Mission and Discipleship Consultant. And maybe you can explain a little bit more about you. Who will talking us about his paper about the climate emergency as Kairos.
Yeah, thanks very much, Nicholas. I suppose by way of introduction, it would probably be most helpful to say why I chose this particular topic. The Kairos document came out of the South African townships during the political crisis in the mid-1980s. But that's also where I cut my theological teeth. And I was very involved at that time with the theological struggle against apartheid. It was one of the strands. And the thing about the Kairos document, it's almost strange thinking back, but it was really the first time that social analysis was employed and deployed with real rigor to take a look at a theological issue, which was also a political issue. It was a military issue. It was a social issue, a racial issue, and an economic issue. And it actually changed the course of the debate. So, you know, up until that time, whether you were talking theologically, politically, economically, or whatever, it was a bit like people throwing proof texts at each other, you know. I'm going to give you 1 Corinthians 7, verse 12, and you're going to give me back Mark 7:45. And the same thing would go on theologically. So the kind of arguments of how do we deal with this issue of apartheid, this crisis that is actually people are dying in the streets. How do we deal with it? A great deal of energy, particularly among the kind of churches we represent, the more the liberal, white, English-speaking churches, with a keen social conscience. Very typically, it would be about aiming at moral conversion. How do we get people to start behaving decently and Christianly? You know, if only we could do that, then we wouldn't have this issue. So theologically, suddenly social analysis is deployed to say, where's the church? What is happening? Who's got the power? Who's it being used by and against and for? And what's the nature of it all? And it was incredibly helpful because suddenly everything became manageable. I don't mean it became easy to fix. I mean it became manageable to have conversations about what was going on theologically and politically. So it enabled us to have by us, I mean the church, the Christian church in South Africa, which was all over the place. It suddenly enabled us to have conversations about a crisis where we could map onto the conversation, where we were coming from, why we were saying what we were saying, whoever we happen to be, if that makes sense. Of course, apartheid, like the climate crisis, was a catastrophe. And in my paper, I cite the rapporteur from the United Nations, who said, you know, this is the biggest threat that we have ever faced globally and as a human race. So for me, it seemed to me helpful to think, well, if we look at the Kairos document, what does this give us in terms of theologically navigating, theologically informing activism, etc. So that's where I was coming from. And given the scale of the crisis, the question that I found myself with was, first of all, what's the correct response? Is it reformation or is it actually revolution? Is the scale such that this thing can't be fixed? In which case, we can't do a reformation model, because reformation is based on working with the current system, as it were, fixing it, tweaking it, wholesale reformation, but it's using the system. Is that possible? And for me, it isn't, because theologically, it's a question of, we're not going to fix this thing tomorrow, whichever way we go. But reformation takes time. We know it takes time. And the question is, who is going to pay the cost for the time that it's going to take? And everybody is quite clear that it's the poorest and the least able to, whether we're talking about individuals, households, or communities and countries. So for me, the question is then, we need a revolution. We need to change the game. The system cannot be fixed. Now, theologically, for me, that's called sin in the Bible. It's something that can't be fixed. The system cannot be fixed. That's what Easter is all about. It can't be fixed, it can't be reformed, it can't be mended, it can only die. And something new needs to rise in its place. So I'm thinking in terms of kind of Easter-shaped revolution in that sense. And as happened in South Africa, the key question was, what about the violence? That was a huge issue for the church. It hadn't wrestled with it in that sense. And we're dealing with the same issue here, you know, the violence and the attendant injustice that's part of the climate crisis. And what's interesting is that this is a non-theological analysis, isn't it, that comes to us from the United Nations, that basically says it's the G20 and the big global economies that are actually inflicting this on the poorest and the least able to bear it. So there's structural violence that's there, and I mean, I'm just dotting around in the paper, as it were, to try and put together the moves that I've been making. And what we're seeing there is how empire works. And the thing about empire is that it's always the same people who come out top, and it's always the same people who actually bear the cost. And how do we deal with that as churches? And I looked at our own denomination, my own denomination, the United Reformed Church. We're not good at revolution. You know, the bottom line is that, and these are a couple of facts I've heard today. You know, a couple of ministers went on a protest and were threatened with Section O. And yet, you know, you can be ordained into the United Reformed Church and made a military chaplain. We have services in our churches for the 11th of November. One of the churches I regularly visit has got one of those silhouette cutouts of a World War I soldier. It's a permanent fixture in the sanctuary of the church. So it's, you know, more acceptable to go and kill somebody for king and country than it is to glue yourself to the highway for the sake of the planet. And I'm looking at this issue of disruptive protest, which seems to me the obvious response from a Christian point of view. If you're not going to engage in violence, what are you going to do? And why is it that XR and CCA and Just Stop Oil are viewed with suspicion and unease by churches as extremists rather than as our natural champions and spokespeople for what we should be doing as churches in response? The Kairos document looks at three responses: state theology, which is any form of justification for the status quo, whether it's climate or apartheid, and deploy concepts like law and order. And we've seen how disruptive protest is being criminalized. And Kate, if you haven't told everybody the story about what's going on in the courts, you need to do that as part of this follow-up discussion, please. Church theology, which is about, essentially in South Africa, that was the liberal churches who were strong and rigorous in their criticism of apartheid, but lacked social analysis. So they were deploying concepts that didn't give structural analysis to questions of power and violence. And lastly, prophetic theology towards a Kairos, which has led me in the paper to say that the scale of the problem that we're facing and the enormity of the issues, the entrenched structural injustice and violence, our inability to face up to the scale of it, and certainly to do anything that is timely enough to do enough. You know, we're in a situation with the climate crisis on us. What can we do as churches? Is there anything distinctive that we can say? What about saying, forget about saying we've got a climate crisis. You know, we all know we've got a climate crisis. It is news to some of the churches, but saying so is saying nothing. It adds nothing to the debate. Calling it a Kairos that says this is a moment of truth, and that how we as churches respond to the climate crisis tells us what we believe about God, about salvation, about what God has done in Jesus to save the world. You know, it's one of those things. It's like the man by the side of the road is being mugged. And what the passers-by, how they respond to that passerby, tells you everything that you need to know theologically about what's going on and what's needed and what kind of God we need. So call it a crisis. Call it a status confessionis. You know, part of the struggle is that we have some lunatic churches in the States who are saying things like, you know, we don't need to worry about global warming because Jesus is coming back. That's a direct quote from one of George Bush's energy spokespersons in the early 2000s. But more importantly, we need to say that we need to expose all these this unease about costly, effective protest and action. We need to expose that and say this is actually siding with empire. This has got no future under God, and it's time that we took the kinds of actions for a world that has a future under God. And that's where it takes me. Yeah, thank you. I won't take the minute, Nicholas. I mean, I hope that sort of shows the stepping stones in what I've tried to say in the paper.
Thanks, Lawrence. I propose we hear all our other presenters, and then we go to the questions, to a round of questions. Maybe also a dialogue between our presenters. So we continue with you, Daimon Mkandawere, who is the Mission Secretary for Ecology and Economy in the Council for World Mission. He already introduced himself, so he will tell us about ecological and economic injustice, the Zambia perspective. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I want to begin by sharing what inspired me to write about this subject. I grew up in a mining town in Zambia, in Chingola. And while growing up, we faced a lot of injustices from the mining company, especially in terms of pollution, I remember one time, a friend of mine, we went swimming by a nearby river. As we were swimming, little did we know that the water was contaminated. And that contamination that happened because of the mines, we ended up losing a number of lives, and a dear friend of mine died in that incident because of the heavily polluted water that we went into and we were swimming. The communities were affected in such a way that the drinking water was also contaminated, and many of them had diarrhea and other complications. But what amazed me was this, that as a very young person, I heard that the copper mine, Konkola copper mines, were fined only $2,000. Remember that lives have been lost, thousands of people have had diarrhea, a lot of them hospitalized, but only fined $2,000. We went to church for the burial of a dear friend. And then the minister, while preaching, said something that hurt me. Up to today, I feel like, what is this? The minister said, it is the will of God that this young man dies. And the blessing pronounced. And the church kept silent, but all they said was, it is the will of God. I think for me, that is where I draw my inspiration. I said, no, this is not the will of God. As a very young man, I said to myself, that's not God. So I come from that background of seeing how the impact of these mining companies have brought on so many lives in my communities and in Zambia in general. But allow me to just summarize the paper that I have written and working on it. Zambia is a blessed country with abundant natural resources, including diverse landscapes, wild forests, and natural reserves. These resources play a critical role in sustaining the economy and supporting the livelihood of many Zambians. However, Zambia faces significant environmental challenges that threaten the sustainability of these resources. One of the key challenges is mining-related pollution. The mining industry, particularly copper mining, has led to environmental degradation, including soil erosion, deforestation, pollution, and these have had adverse effects on the health and well-being of the local communities in many Zambian communities. The climate crisis is another pressing challenge that we're experiencing in Zambia. Zambia is experiencing increased temperatures, reduced rainfall, and prolonged droughts, which affect agriculture productivity and contribute to poverty levels. As we speak, unfortunately, Zambia, and I say unfortunately, because we boast of having about 61% of her people living below the poverty line, meaning that 61% of the population of Zambia lives below $2 per day. And mind you, the average family in Zambia is a membership of 5. So 5 people in a family living below $2 per day and translating to 61%. Unfortunately, Zambia's economy relies on copper mining, making it vulnerable to fluctuations in international copper prices. And the over-reliance on this sector hampers the economic growth and development. The agriculture sector faces its own challenges, including limited access to education, healthcare, infrastructure, which further hinder the economic process. Not only this, corruption within the governance of natural resources has been a long-standing issue in Zambia. Today, illegal mining revenue mismanagement, lack of transparency, and a weak regulatory framework contribute to the problems that we face. Corruption deprives the country of its essential resources that could be used for infrastructure development, education, healthcare, and poverty alleviation. In my paper, I propose that to address these challenges, there is a need for a theology of ecological and economic justice that is culturally relevant to Zambia's community. I am proposing that the church, given its influence over personal moral development, can play a vital role in shaping ecological and economic justice in Zambia. Religious teachings emphasize the importance of environmental care, economic justice, and sustainability. I further propose that by preaching ecologically sensitive sermons and promoting a purposeful ideology of orientation for sustainable ecological and economic justice praxis, the church can make a difference. She can encourage behavioral change, reconnect communities with nature, and provide compelling reasons for engagement in environmental conservation. Furthermore, the church can advocate for structural changes by addressing corruption and promoting transparency, accountability in the governance of natural resources. By leveraging its moral authority and speaking truth to power in love, the church can champion the cause of the poor and hold responsible those who contribute most to environmental damage. In conclusion, Zambia's rich natural resources are at risk due to mining-related pollution, climate change, and illegal wildlife trade. The country's reliance on copper mining and economic challenges in the agriculture sector hinder its development. However, the church, with its influence and moral authority, can contribute to ecological and economic justice by promoting environmental care, advocating against corruption, and inspiring behavioral change. By embracing its mandate for sustainability, the church can shape an ethos of earth-keeping and work towards a more just and sustainable future for Zambia. In the Zambian context, the church holds a lot of power, and thus the church must use her power and as a voice to speak with the voiceless to bring about environmental and economic justice in Zambia. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you, Daimon. So we have now two very challenging inputs with the question reformation or revolution. How do we put our actions into practice? Sadly, Bob couldn't join in, so we will just now refer to these two presentations, and I would suggest we begin with your questions from the people here on the floor, and also you can write your comments on the chat, and we take maybe 3 questions, and then you can address them to Lawrence or to Daimon, and we try, yes, for a first round of questions. Please. Victoria.
Do I need to move?
Sorry, this thing's.
No, it's okay. Oh.
Hold on.
For the benefit of those who are looking there.
So could you maybe do like just for me just to try and set it back for us, please? Thank you. Oh, brilliant, thank you.
Lawrence and Damon, you both talked about the power the church has. So Lawrence, you talked about the power that comes when we discern prophetic theology in contrast to church or state theology. And Damon, in the end, you talked about the power that the church has in the Zambian context in overcoming the corruption. Can you detail a little bit more in practice with the environmental problem, what power you see the church having and how we can implement that power?
Thanks. Power question, another question? So yes, please, come, Kate, come here.
So my question is for Lawrence. You've posed the question revolution or reformation, and you're endorsing revolution. What does revolution within the United Reformed Church look like? That's my question.
Yes. I believe I cut Lawrence short when he was about to tell us about this, and so I have to ask your pardon. And maybe one question more. I see Jan there. Maybe you want to unmute yourself and make the question, or should I read it? Jan. I read. Daimon spoke about corruption. Is the church involved in any way with the corruption? Is the question. Okay, let's go around with these questions. Lawrence.
Right. Yeah, thanks for those. Not really, but there we go. Forced to say it out of politeness. The issue of Victoria, the issue of what power the church has. I think I lived in Zambia and Zimbabwe, and I think that the role and place of the church is very different from where it is here. You know, now we're post-Christian. The church has still got a strong voice, as Daimon has reminded us. When it comes to, I have to say that when it comes to the issue of climate crisis, I think the embarrassing thing is, as the church, that we come late. The other really embarrassing thing is that we also come with a kind of savior complex a lot of the time. It's kind of like, okay, guys, we're here, the church is here, everything's fine, God's here, because we've brought God here. And actually the kind of power that we have as a church is only the power of repentance, only the power of beginning to align ourselves with where God is on all this stuff. And it's the power of the mustard seed. You know, the promise is that when we do kingdom stuff or holy anarchy stuff, it just needs to be the size of a mustard seed, and it's disproportional in it. That's not a kind of conscious power play, and I think that's really good. So that's what I would see, the sort of power that's going on. And the other kind of power is the power that God's truth actually has. And I think we've lost it as a church. You know, we've lost it since at least 313, where we can divorce our theology from our lives and our acting, so we can have arguments about what truth is, and we can live lives that are radically un-Christ-like. You know, and we have been part and parcel as a church of the whole human project that is leading where to global annihilation. Christian truth is incarnational. You know, that's Jesus. Jesus is God's truth on legs. And it's only as people begin to see God's truth on legs when the church in God's name does what God really wants us to do. That has a real power. It's not our power. It's a power that we got there. And I think there's one other particular power that we could bring into play. And again, it's not a sort of typical power play. We have an understanding biblically about what repentance means. Repentance isn't just going, oh, we've made a mistake. It's not just going, I'm very, very sorry. There's, repentance entails remorse. It entails repentance, turning away. It entails restitution. It entails reparation. It entails continued resistance. And I think we as a church can bring those. I wonder what would happen if the church put its back behind the call for reparations for countries that are already affected by climate change. So that's a kind of power thing. The revolution, Kate, revolution is radical in the sense that it's tearing things up by their roots because we know that they don't work. I think when I'm talking about revolution in that Christian sense, I'm meaning two things. One, it is Easter shaped, so it's costly, it's life-giving in that sense of life-giving as well as life-giving, and it's non-violent. But we have got to lose our fascination with being part of the system and being power players within that system. And a revolution means that we stop looking to the power players within the system to fix things. They're the problem. That's the problem. It's where the situation is. So when the bishop when the bishop calls for let's declare a climate crisis and let's work on behalf of all people, etc., etc. I'm not trying to be funny, and I'm not being mocking. I'm just saying this is actually wrong-headed. It's not going to change stuff, even though we'd like to do that. So the revolution is to start doing what we need to do as Christians, which is to focus people's attention entirely on the victims of climate crisis, because the change has got to start there. It's not going to start up there and eventually percolate down. It's got to start there, and to me, that recalls that's a reformation of the church. It recalls us to our roots and our heart. And I think that will be very powerful in terms of what it does to churches, just as much as it does to the community. Why we as the United Reformed Church think it's really important to give an address to the throne at our General Assembly, which doesn't say, you do realize, of course, Your Majesty, that you are part of the future, that has no future under God. It's not that eschatology that we believe in. So it's recalling us to all those kinds of things. I'm far more coherent in my head than I am in my heart. So I'm sorry, just stop me and say you're talking rubbish.
Okay, so thanks. This brings us also back to Bonhoeffer and the cost of discipleship. No, it's not cheap grace, but kind of grace. But we had also questions to Daimon, so it's your turn, Daimon, to share with us.
Thank you, and thank you, Victoria, for the question. I think part of the question has been answered when it comes to the issue of power. Mbiti, one of the African scholars, once said that Africans are religiously notorious. For us in Africa, everything is religious. From birth to death, it's all about religion. And whatever we do is about religion. And when we talk of Zambia, Zambia maybe is the only country in Africa that has been declared as a Christian nation, which entails that over 89% of the Zambian population are Christians. Meaning that we have masses of people that are flocking to church on every Sunday, on every Saturday, and every Wednesday. These people gather willingly, and if the church positions herself to begin to teach ecologically and economically sound messages, the church has power to transform people's behaviors in how they relate to the environment. You'll be surprised that for me, who's an ordained minister, in my community, whatever I say, many people will follow. And unfortunately, you hear stories in the Zambian community or in most of the African communities, people will tell their flocks or their members to eat grass. They'll tell them to drink poison, and they do that. They drink because and unfortunately, the church is participating in such nonsense. What I'm trying to say is that the church has got a voice within the communities in Africa and in Zambia particular. And so we must harness that power and voice to use it for transformation, that we create eco-disciples, people that will be responsible for caring for the earth and will journey with us in creation care. I hope that answers your question, Victoria. The second question on corruption, I want to answer this one. I look at it in two ways. Like I mentioned, the church, the Zambian population, 98% of its population are Christians. And so the question I ask is, who then is involved in corruption? If 98%, I feel it is the church members. So if this corruption is taking place, and we are saying that in Zambia, there's a lot of corruption in the mining sector, in whatever industry, for me, I always say it is my members in the church that are involved in these corrupt practices. In fact, the president of our country right now is an elder of the church. Most of his ministers in the cabinet are church members and elders. And so if corruption is taking place, it simply means it is the very church members, the elders, the leaders of the church that are involved in corruption. And so the church is not speaking up. Just recently, when one minister tried to speak against the president, the entire party, political party, rose against him and they scandalized him. So we live in a place where when I hear things of revolution, protest, that they are a little bit different within my context. That is why I propose that we need a theology in Zambian context that is culturally relevant in my community. Because the moment you hear me say, I'm protesting against my government, the next headline you hear is that Daimon Mkandawere is in prison. That is the reality that we live in. And that changes the whole ball game and how we deal with these issues. I submit.
Thanks. Okay, this was the first round of questions. I thank you for your answers. Do we have more questions or opinions from the public here or there? And maybe the speakers have questions for each other. If Lawrence wants to ask Daimon or Daimon, Lawrence, please also feel free to ask or to maybe to make a commentary about what you heard.
I think one of the questions I've got is how much resonance there is with the analysis I've tried to make of why the United Reformed Church finds it so difficult to do stuff that really matters rather than the easy stuff. You know, we are very good becoming eco-churches and doing no mow may and doing all the things that we can in our houses. But you know, if we said to our churches, right, let's affiliate with Extinction Rebellion or CCA or whatever, you know, that would be very difficult for a lot of members who would otherwise be strong evangelists for the cause of climate crisis, responding to climate crisis. You know, I mean, for me, the only thing I can think of is that it actually shows that we are far more comfortable in an empire model of church, Christendom model of church. And my fundamental conviction is that the reason that the church is going down the toilet these days is not because of the diversification of leisure and all sorts of other, you know, intellectual atheism. It's basically because the church has lost its credibility because it doesn't practice what Jesus practiced and preaches. Churches that do are valued. And I think we've been stuck. But I'm interested to know what you think about that.
Simon, please come.
Thank you. Thank you. Just to offer some sort of response to that, reaction to that, Simeon Mitchell. And thank you. I've got a huge amount of sympathy with most of the things you're saying, Lawrence, except as someone who was involved particularly in the implementation of the environmental policy of the church and getting it to the point where it is today, I have to say, people aren't really on board with that, and they aren't really doing it. Some are very faithfully and brilliantly, but it's a minority that are actually doing the practical stuff too. And I think the stuff about the culture of the church actually prevents many people taking action at all on anything. So I'm not sure you should paint them as opposites. And I just wonder, I suppose for me, one of the key questions to ask about anything and any kind of justice issue is what's going to be most effective in bringing about change. And I think for some people in the church, preaching revolution and inviting them into non-violent acts of resistance would be brilliant and would really float their boat and would bring about some change in some places. And in other places, that might cause people to just shut up shop and go home. And maybe that's for the best, but I don't know. But I'm interested in what reaction you think that would have.
Yes. Maybe if we give first Daimon, still your turn, and then we come back to Lawrence. No, if you want to comment also or make a question.
Let me allow Lawrence to go on. I'll get in.
So you pick up.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. I'm still thinking, Simeon. I think you're obviously right that there are large swathes of the church that don't do anything about anything. But I'm becoming less and less enchanted with the idea that we can get the church to do stuff, you know, as though there was one church and one size that fits all. And again, this is a kind of Kairos theological framework, and it extends across all sorts of things. But I'm just becoming less and less. I think that the institutional church is so far away from what church is that actually what these kinds of presenting questions are sifting questions. It's like the sorting hat in Harry Potter, you know, at Hogwarts. And how we respond to these things shows us where we are in terms of what I would want to think of as church as Jesus defines it, which is an alternative community of resistance. So I think that we put these things out there and we say, this is what we believe, or this is what we're doing. And what we do by doing that is we find our tribe, the people for whom this is good news, the people who respond, who say, actually, this is just what I've been waiting for, waiting to hear. And I think that's what I would be interested in doing. I'm not going to spend time and energy trying to convert people who are never going to be converted. I'd much rather try and find the tribe, as it were, and then the tribe goes and tells the people that I'll never convince or reach. And that actually, I get into a lot of trouble for this. I do believe there is such a thing as the true church, and it's the church that lives like Jesus. And actually, I think it's very small and it's very difficult. It's all that stuff about it's a thin road, a narrow road, and a narrow gate, and all that kind of thing. And particularly when it comes to things like climate crisis, it's the activists who are showing us the way. And it's how we respond to that, because we're so far behind. Is that remotely coherent? I suppose what I'm saying at the end of the day is, I think we need to trust the insights of what we're saying. And we go with them, and we go with them whether many people go with us or not, and whether or not many people actually respond. I'm not sure that effectiveness is the criterion of what we should be doing. Hopefully it will be though. Sorry, it is.
Okay. Huh? I have now.
Together. We both put our hands on the
Okay, yeah, I have 3 hands now. Yes, and Daimon, also you are to join.
No.
Yes.
No.
I think that's Fee sorting the dog out.
Then, Chrissy first.
We're trying to grasp something, and we don't know what it is we're trying to lay hold of as a solution. But I have that picture of the monkey that's got its fist in the hole in the tree, and it's clinging to the peanuts. And the reason the monkey can't grasp what it really needs, which is not the peanuts in the tree, it's the peanuts on the ground right in front of it, is because we cling to models of religion, we cling to practices. And for those outside the church, we have to understand that we are part of the system, we are part of the problem, and that actually what we model on Sundays, and the fact that so many of our churches revolve entirely around Sundays, which are run by professional ministries to perpetuate buildings, which is built on converted theology. Those are some of the things that we're clinging to for our identity, because we've always done that. That's our comfort. And we have a generation in our churches for whom that is a very real need. But at the same time, it can be the very thing we're clinging to that stops us from being able to see the peanuts on the ground, which is the solutions. And so what I think I'm trying to say is, sometimes we have to think outside the box. Sometimes we even have to explode the box. And if religious theatre on Sunday is stopping us from doing church Monday to Saturday, then is it worth clinging to religious theatre on Sunday? That's not to denigrate the ministry of the word. That's not to denigrate worship. But if we think that worship is only church on Sunday, we've not understood what worship is. So I'm just coming in as my usual subversive anarchistic self to be the cat amongst the pigeons, to ask questions that I think my children are looking at the church and thinking, you're just going along with the system, you've lost the plot, the reality isn't there.
Thanks. We go then now the full round.
I've spoken quite a lot, so.
Study.
Please do. Okay.
And I have a commentary here behind me.
Yeah, I was really just trying to give Lawrence a break so that he could think about what he was saying and get his thoughts together. So two things really. One has to do with the sense of our activists. And I think one of the things that we picked up earlier on this afternoon is there is a tendency when we have groups that are activists that we tend to turn them into laughing stocks. I think there's also another side of that, is that we also tend to slip a little bit of violence in there. So suddenly, as a church, we can't agree with your protests because people are there making fun of you, and on the other hand, even more so, making you out to be people of violence. So I think there is a real challenge as to how we manage our activists, and one of the ways in which we experience that is when we picked up on Black Lives Matter, yeah? We said very clearly as a denomination that we weren't supporting the political and the original meaning behind that. What we're actually saying is all lives matter, but that statement only comes in a reality when Black Lives Matter. But people, particularly in our churches, picked out that sense that we were supporting some anarchist, angry organization that was going to bring down the police force, you know? And we never went anywhere near that when we made the statement that we were going to stand by this. So I think there's a real issue about how people interpret our activism and what it is we're trying to do. And I think the second and final bit that I wanted to actually suggest was actually, Lawrence, you had somehow given us the answer to the question. Let's go back to the Good Samaritan. If we could bring enough stories of the people in our world today who are struggling, I am sure there are, well, I'm hoping that there are enough Christians within the URC who would want to become activists once they hear that story. They have to go back to the life of Jesus. And I know, in a sense, when Jesus said, the Good Samaritan, he told that story. If we look at the way the Samaritans are portrayed in biblical terms and in Jewish times, good Samaritan, those two words don't go well together. So what we need to do is look at that story, understand the theology behind it, what Jesus was trying to say, and pick up on the people in our world and in our society who are really struggling. Thank you. Does that help?
It does. Thank you.
Okay, and then we have Nadine. From my church experience, church members are extremely averse to being seen to break the law of
Excellent.
Extinction Rebellion.
Extinction Rebellion, and they see it as unchristian.
Did you maybe want Mary to say something about that?
So,
Do you want
Yeah,
to-
sure. I'm happy to speak. I just wanted to share from our church experience that we were in contact with Kate, and we wanted Kate to come to our church. Well, I wanted Kate to come to our church to share her experience of why, as a Christian, she was involved in Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, etc. So we just wanted to hear her story about why it was important for her to be an activist in this nonviolent way. And so I spoke to the elders, and eventually they agreed that we could do it, but from the point of view of let's be open to hearing all sides of the story, even if we don't agree. So we went ahead and organized it, and there was so little response, we changed the date to a better day. And in the end, the only two people who came was myself and the Church of England priest across the road, and then my husband. So the three of us came to meet with Kate. There was just such a resistance to even being open to talking about the possibilities of being an activist in this way. And I tried to hear what the concerns were, and it really felt like it came down to this absolute fear of breaking the law or being seen to break the law, and that would be seen as incredibly unchristian and not fitting for the church. So it's like an enormous barrier that goes up. And I see my congregation as quite progressive and very socially aware. And for them, that was far too far to take that step. So it does leave me feeling a little bleak for our average URC churches and how they see being involved in this crisis and acting as if it is a crisis that we are facing. Thank you.
thanks. And so we have also the way to return to Daimon. We have a question, a commentary and question by Gwen and Bernie. I don't know if you want to say it or should I read it? You're on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. You to read it.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, I'm happy for you to read it. Thank you.
Okay. So churches in Zambia and in Papua New Guinea, where Gwen and I work, run health services, education, food production and sale, construction, vehicle services, etc. Development, we believe important for life, is now challenged by our understanding of the effect on climate, soils, biodiversity, etc. Are people in Zambia finding ways to provide services, agriculture and industry and transport in more sustainable ways? And can we learn from that in the United Kingdom, Papua New Guinea and elsewhere? Okay, and with that question, we shift to Daimon and then back to Lawrence. But Daimon, also feel free to comment on the other questions, no?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, the church in Zambia runs a number of institutions. I was privileged to run a hospital for 4 years in Zambia before joining a CWM. I was hospital administrator. But while providing those services, because my passion was to deal with environment, and in the church came up, and I'll answer this question in the confines of the United Church of Zambia. So what we did in the United Church of Zambia is, one, we piloted a program that we were calling Children with Nature. This was a way of responding to issues of climate change, and we wanted to equip young people, young children with knowledge. So we used to have summer camps with children. We would go to the falls, we would go to the rivers and teach young children eco-friendly stories. And from that, we we developed young children to grow up with ecologically sensitive awareness. I remember a story, one child telling the father that, "Daddy, what you are doing," the father littered and the child said, "Father, what you're doing is an ecological sin." It is those stories that we realize that children are beginning to learn about issues to do with the environment. So after piloting the program, what we did is that we introduced tree planting in schools. The United Church of Zambia has a number of schools, about 11 secondary schools. And so what happened was that whenever they enrolled a child into school, the child was asked to plant a tree. Not only to plant that tree, but to grow it. They start grade 8, they will have to look after that tree until they leave that school. We also have an agriculture school called Chipembi College of Farming. That college, we have ensured as the United Church of Zambia that it responds to, it does agriculture in a sustainable way. So we are into organic farming, alternative kinds of farming. Those are some of the initiatives that the United Church of Zambia has come up with and trying to respond to issues of the climate crisis. They are not big projects, but these are projects that are changing the way people look at things and projects that are able to inspire people to do more. And given the capacity, I believe that they can expand and many lives can be touched. But allow me also to respond to just make a comment on the story of the Good Samaritan. I love the story and it offers us a lot of opportunities and lessons. And I want to quickly submit that for me, the story of the Good Samaritan, and I look at the Good Samaritan and in relation to issues of the climate crisis. But I also think that what we need to do is not only look at the Good Samaritan, but also look at the road itself and deal with the injustices within the road. So in other ways, the systemic issues that are taking place, the church needs to up its game and continue to fight that the system changes, because we may have a Good Samaritan, but if the system is the same, then we are not doing anything. So we should focus on also dealing with the systems of the world. When talking of repentance and reparations, this is key. We need to, the church needs to take on that subject and try to expand on issues of reparations in the face of climate crisis. And yes, let us think outside the box as a church, and we will be more effective than we are today.
Thanks, Daimon, and then Lawrence.
Yeah, thanks. Probably just several thoughts from various parts of the conversations that have been going on. The question about, there was somewhere it came up about the church being solution focused, and whilst I think that's obviously a good thing, it's also a very premature thing, because there's a sense in which we have no idea what the things that will bring about the necessary changes are. We haven't got there yet. We're still imprisoned imaginatively, you know, in the system as it's always been for us. So we can get as far as thinking, well, what we could do is we could all switch over to electric cars. Now, that's helpful, and I must admit, you know, when we switched over, it made economic sense, and it doesn't anymore. But you know, that's the cost of changing. It's not going to be electric cars as we've got them now that are going to solve the problem, because you know, over the life of a car, you know, there's something like 79% of the lithium-ion battery stuff is 70. It's the carbon equivalent of 79% of normal cars anyway. The thing is though, once we start moving away from something, things that we've never thought of begin to open up. And so we're, I think one of the things I want to keep saying as a Christian, I want to say as a church, the fact that we have an Easter faith means that our best days are always ahead of us, not behind us. And that is true of the climate crisis. We're just at the stage where we're beginning to engage. And faith for me means about, being in touch and having one's imagination sparked as to what then becomes possible. That's just one thing. It also, just the phrase solution focused made me think, what is it that we do focus enthusiastically on as churches? And it's not the climate crisis, it's sexuality, it's Black Lives Matter, it's all sorts of things that we get excited about that actually don't require real costly change in us. It's always them somewhere, it's always them that needs to change. We just got to get with the program, as Daimon was saying, and realize this is part of us. The other thing that we're not good at, and it's come up a couple of times, the whole question of violence. We're not good at distinguishing between anger and violence. And those two are really important. And Nadine's comment brought that out. The prophets rage, God rages, Jesus rages at what is going on. Injustice and fear and looking at extinction, generates that kind of anger, and that's a healthy, proportionate response that finds an echo in God if Jesus reveals God to us. So anger is important. The thing about Jesus and his example is that he doesn't respond to violence with violence, but what he does is to act in such a way that it makes the violence that's endemic to the system nakedly visible. And that's what people obviously like, Gandhi did. That scene where they made salt, remember, and they just wave after wave walked up to the soldiers and were clubbed down. And simply by walking up and confronting the system, it shows who's who and what's what. That's partly what it is all about. And so we need to be a bit more sophisticated about anger and its important place. And I think the last thing I wanted to say was two quotes from Desmond Tutu. One of the things that Desmond Tutu was quite clear about was that there was no church position that was different from other positions in society over the struggle over apartheid, and it's true about the climate crisis. What he said was you had to sort of make a choice about where you're going to stand. And you stand with the least. Once you stand there unequivocally, then you have the right to comment and criticize, but you do so from within. And for Tutu, Tutu never agreed with the ANC's armed struggle, but he was unequivocally and part of the ANC, and we need to learn that. If we want to criticize people like XR or whatever, we must do so from inside. We've no right to criticize from the outside. And the last thing, and it goes back, I think Daimon said pretty much the same thing about the parable of the Good Samaritan. The parable of the Good Samaritan is ultimately about the compassion that is at the heart of God. And compassion responds first of all to the immediate need, that that says, I cannot leave this untouched, I've got to do something about it. But then, as Daimon was saying, you've got to look at the road, you know, and Tutu phrased it the same thing differently. He said, at some point, we've got to stop as churches from just fishing people out of the river and head upstream to find out who's throwing them in. And, you know, I think as churches, the bits of the church that I'm involved, and I would say this about myself as well too, I haven't yet moved from the things that I can do and the immediate needs. So I can buy my electric car, I can get as much, you know, energy efficient building as I can. I can not mow my lawn in May and do all those things. But actually to move to the bits where you're confronting the structures, I would say I need to make that move. What I'm looking for is a community within the church with whom to do it. And I finish with a little parable from South Africa. There were two Afrikaner saints in the struggle against apartheid. One was Beyers Naudé, and the other was Theo Kotze. And the thing about both of them was that they were leading Dutch Reformed Church members and office holders who had represented the Dutch Reformed Church at the Cottesloe Conference in 1960 that had investigated the Sharpeville shootings. And they came back to their churches and said, apartheid is sinful, it's wrong. And they were treated terribly, you know. And what they then did was they moved into black townships. They said, we can't just keep living in our white neighborhoods. Theo Kotze and his wife moved in on their own. Within 18 months, they both had nervous breakdowns. Beyers Naudé was part of a community that was involved in moving into the township. And they survived and thrived because there was a community. And it's that thing, if we are to be a community of resistance as part of our witness in the struggle against climate crisis, you know, individual saints are great, but they're the prophets and the martyrs. For the rest of us, we need the community, and that's what we need to find.
Thank you. I just since our time has run out, I wanted to ask each of you for final remarks, but I believe yours have already been the final remarks. So thank you, Lawrence. Daimon, your final remarks.
Thank you. I'm a man of very few words. I think in ending, I would say that the church is indeed positioned in a way that she can make a big difference, particularly within the Zambian community. And I only pray that we will be able to harness the power that the church has to bring about economic and ecological justice. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much. Each of the presenters, each of you with your questions and remarks and lively inputs today. So I believe we can close this session before we move to our final worship. And still only to remember you that we continue tomorrow at 9:15 with our morning prayers. 9:15 tomorrow morning. Yes.